Imagine this, it's the spring of 1943. Japanese forces scan the horizon of a tiny Pacific atoll, confident that it will take months before the Americans can bring heavy bombers into range. They believe time is on their side. Then, seemingly overnight, something impossible happens. The U.S. Navy's construction battalions, nicknamed the Seabees, land on barren coral and jungle. Armed not with rifles but with bulldozers, graders, and dynamite, they carve out an airstrip longer than an aircraft carrier in less than 3 weeks. The Japanese intelligence reports are incredulous. An airfield shouldn't rise out of nothing in 20 days. Yet B-24s are soon thundering down runways where only palm trees and scrub had stood weeks before. This wasn't magic. It was the Seabees, engineers who worked like soldiers and fought like Marines. Their feat stunned both allies and enemies, and forever changed the tempo of the Pacific War. This is the story of how those airstrips, built at impossible speed, shocked Japan, saved American lives, and left a legacy that still shapes military engineering today. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast blue wilderness dotted with tiny specks of land that seemed almost insignificant against the immensity of water. Yet these islands, many of them little more than strips of coral or volcanic rock, would become some of the most hotly contested pieces of ground in World War II. For the Japanese, they were bastions of defense, outposts that extended their empire's protective wall across thousands of miles. For the Americans, they were stepping stones, each one needed to bring bombers closer to Japan itself. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had already proven to be a logistical nightmare. Every mile gained required an enormous investment of ships, men, fuel, and supplies. The Japanese had spent years fortifying key islands, building bunkers, gun placements, and airstrips in anticipation of an American advance. To hold these islands, they relied not just on soldiers but on the simple fact of geography. The distances were staggering, the terrain unforgiving. Dense jungles, razor-sharp coral, and sweltering tropical heat made even simple construction tasks arduous. For Japan, this seemed like a natural advantage. They assumed that any serious attempt by the United States to carve out airfields and bases in such remote and inhospitable places would take months, if not longer. Time, they believed, would always be on their side. The truth was that American war planners faced a terrifying dilemma. Heavy bombers like the B-24 Liberator or the B-29 Superfortress could strike Japanese supply lines, bases, and eventually the home islands themselves, but only if there were runways long enough and close enough to launch them. Without airstrips, the Pacific Islands were little more than rocks jutting out of the sea. With airstrips, they became powerful weapons, able to project American might hundreds of miles farther. The question was how to build those runways before the Japanese could react. Early in the war, traditional Army engineers had already tried their hand at construction under fire. The results were slow and costly. They had the knowledge to build, but they weren't trained to fight. And in the Pacific, the frontlines shifted unpredictably. Construction units could find themselves under artillery bombardment, sniper fire, or even full-scale assaults while still trying to pour concrete. What the United States needed was something entirely new, men who were both skilled craftsmen and combat-ready fighters. The solution would come in the form of the Naval Construction Battalions, soon to be known by their famous nickname, the Seabees. The Seabees represented a radical idea. Rather than drafting young men with no experience, the Navy looked instead to older, skilled workers, carpenters, welders, steelworkers, electricians, miners, men who already knew how to build in tough conditions. Many of them were in their 30s or even 40s, far older than the average infantryman. They were told they would have to build under fire, and if necessary, pick up rifles to defend their own work. Their motto captured the dual nature of their mission: we build, we fight. It was one thing to put that motto on paper, and another to live it out on the far side of the Pacific. From the moment they arrived on islands recently seized by Marines, the Seabees were thrust into a world of chaos. The ground was often still smoking from bombardments, enemy snipers lurked in the tree line, and unexploded shells littered the beaches. Yet within hours of landing, bulldozers were roaring ashore, sometimes lashed precariously to barges or pushed off landing craft directly into the surf. These ungainly machines, caked in saltwater and mud, became as vital to the war effort as rifles and grenades. For the Japanese, who had grown accustomed to thinking of warfare in terms of infantry, artillery, and naval power, the sight of American engineers carving runways out of jungles and coral at impossible speed was bewildering. They assumed it would take months of grueling work before an island was ready to host even a single bomber squadron. Instead, the Seabees were producing functional airstrips in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. Their methods were relentless and improvised. Coral reefs were blasted apart with dynamite, the rubble crushed by bulldozers and compacted into firm bases. Over this, the men laid sheets of pierced steel planking, Marston matting, that locked together like giant puzzle pieces to form instant runways. The process was dirty, noisy, and dangerous, but it worked with breathtaking efficiency. Everywhere they went, the Seabees brought not just construction but transformation. A swampy clearing became a road in a single night. A desolate atoll bristled with hangars and fuel depots before enemy scouts even realized it had been taken. The Japanese, watching from afar, were stunned at how rapidly American air power seemed to materialize where none had existed. For them, the Pacific should have been an oceanic barrier, a moat too wide to be bridged. But with every new runway, the Americans were erasing that advantage. The stakes could not have been higher. Each finished airstrip meant bombers could now strike deeper into Japanese-held territory, reducing the need for long and vulnerable flights from distant bases. Each runway shortened supply lines and extended fighter coverage for naval operations. It was as if the Pacific itself was shrinking, island by island, strip by strip. By the time Japanese reconnaissance flights reported back on the new American bases, it was often too late. Bombers were already in the air, fighters already patrolling the skies. In Tokyo and other command centers, disbelief gave way to alarm. How could the Americans possibly build so fast? How could they bring airfields into operation before the defenders had even regrouped? The answer lay in the sweat and grit of the Seabees, men who had turned construction into a weapon as decisive as any battleship. They were unlike any other unit the U.S. military had ever fielded. When the call first went out in 1942, it wasn't for boys fresh out of high school or young men eager for adventure, it was for seasoned craftsmen who already knew how to bend steel, pour concrete, wire a building, or operate massive machinery. Many had spent their lives on construction sites, in shipyards, or in the mines. Some were fathers with gray at their temples, far older than the average Marine storming ashore beside them. Yet they answered the call because their country needed a different kind of soldier, one who could carry a rifle in one hand and a hammer in the other. They became the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, soon given the nickname that stuck, the Seabees. Their emblem, a tough little bee armed with a hammer, wrench, and a machine gun, captured exactly who they were. These were men who would build airstrips, roads, and bases in the most hostile environments, all while under enemy fire if necessary. They trained not only in the fundamentals of military discipline but also in the use of weapons, so they could defend themselves and their work. The motto they carried onto their helmets and into the jungles was as bold as it was simple: we build, we fight. From the moment they began training, the Seabees stood out. Unlike raw recruits, they already carried themselves with the confidence of men who had built skyscrapers and highways, who had operated machinery worth thousands of dollars, and who had endured hard labor in blistering heat or biting cold. They knew how to improvise, how to fix a broken engine with nothing but spare parts and determination, and how to measure twice and cut once, even when artillery shells fell nearby. Their instructors quickly realized that this was no ordinary battalion. Discipline was looser in some ways. The Navy couldn't exactly bark orders at a 50-year-old master carpenter the same way it would at an 18-year-old sailor, but when it came to getting things done, the Seabees moved with a professionalism that impressed everyone who saw them. Their equipment became as legendary as the men themselves. The bulldozer, in particular, was their symbol of power. To Marines and soldiers fighting their way onto Pacific beaches, the sight of a Seabee bulldozer crawling up the sand was as reassuring as a column of tanks. These machines could push aside wreckage, flatten ground for roads, and even serve as improvised cover against enemy gunfire. One officer once joked that the Americans didn't conquer islands, they bulldozed them into submission. For the Seabees, that wasn't far from the truth. Their landings were unlike anything seen before in warfare. While Marines fought to secure beachheads, Seabees followed right behind them, often with their equipment still dripping saltwater from the ocean. Giant tractors were shoved off landing craft into the surf, sometimes sinking into sand up to their axles before being hauled free by sheer muscle and persistence. Bulldozers churned forward, clearing obstacles and creating makeshift roads for trucks and tanks. At times, the noise of machinery blended with the crack of rifle fire and the whistle of incoming shells. Yet the work continued, day and night, as though the battlefield were just another construction site with a particularly bad weather forecast. What set the Seabees apart was their adaptability. Coral too hard to dig through? Blast it with dynamite, crush it, and use it as fill. Swamp too soft for a runway? Lay down logs, cover them with gravel, then top it with pierced steel planking, Marston matting, that could handle the weight of a bomber. Supplies delayed or destroyed? Improvise with whatever was on hand, from salvaged wreckage to palm trunks. They turned every obstacle into an opportunity, and their solutions often looked improvised but functioned perfectly. Stories quickly spread of their ingenuity. On one island, Seabees repaired a wrecked bulldozer by scavenging parts from abandoned vehicles, keeping it running long after it should have been scrap. On another, they built a fuel depot almost entirely out of coconut logs and scrap metal. Their unofficial motto, passed among themselves with pride, was simple: the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. Even their appearance set them apart. They looked less like polished soldiers and more like rugged workers. Their uniforms were stained with oil and mud, helmets often decorated with hand-painted slogans or the Seabee emblem. They carried rifles slung casually over their shoulders while driving machinery worth its weight in gold. Their language was rough, their humor dark, but their spirit unbreakable. Marines respected them, soldiers relied on them, and even hardened officers admitted that the Seabees often accomplished in days what regular engineers would have needed weeks to finish. The Japanese, when they first encountered these strange American units, struggled to make sense of them. Reconnaissance reports described older men operating bulldozers and cranes on newly captured islands, working as if immune to danger. They could not understand how Americans were turning inhospitable strips of coral and jungle into operational airbases so quickly. To Japanese commanders, accustomed to long, deliberate construction projects, the idea that a functioning airstrip could appear in less than 3 weeks seemed absurd. Yet time and again, the Seabees proved it possible. Behind every miracle of speed was exhaustion. The men often worked in shifts that blurred into one another, with floodlights illuminating construction at night while the humid air hung heavy with mosquitoes. Sweat poured from under their helmets, and mud clung to their boots. Breaks were rare, meals quick, and rest always uncertain. But they understood that every hour saved meant bombers in the sky sooner, and that could decide battles before they even began. In the Pacific theater, victory depended not only on courage in combat but also on the ability to sustain operations across unimaginable distances. The Seabees became the crucial link in that chain, the men who could create the very ground on which the war was fought. Where others saw impossible terrain, they saw a blank canvas waiting for runways, roads, and docks. Their presence turned bare islands into forward fortresses almost overnight, and their reputation spread quickly across both Allied and Japanese lines. The landing was chaos from the very first moment. As the Marines stormed the beaches, gunfire rattling from bunkers hidden in the tree line, the Seabees came ashore right behind them. It was not with rifles at the ready but with bulldozers and graders, lashed to landing craft and shoved down ramps into the surf. The machines roared and groaned as they hit the shallows, engines coughing salt water, their massive steel blades digging into sand. Men scrambled to keep them moving, shouting over the crack of rifles and the thud of mortars. To the untrained eye it looked insane, construction equipment rolling ashore into a battle zone, but this was exactly what they had trained for. Once the beachhead was secure enough to hold against Japanese fire, the Seabees wasted no time. Explosive charges ripped into the coral, sending dust and shards of stone into the humid air. Bulldozers pushed the rubble aside, flattening what had been dense jungle or rocky ground into the beginnings of a level surface. There was no luxury of waiting weeks to survey or plan. Every hour mattered, and every hour was paid for in sweat and danger. The men worked with a singular focus: get the runway ready before the enemy realized what was happening. The days blurred into nights, the work never stopping. Floodlights were hauled ashore and wired up so the bulldozers and graders could keep moving after the sun went down. From a distance, it must have looked like some kind of industrial monster had been unleashed on the island, machines groaning, spotlights cutting through the dark, engines roaring as the Seabees hacked away at the land itself. Japanese artillery occasionally rained down, shells exploding near the work sites, but the men ducked low and then went back to their bulldozers as soon as the dust cleared. A half-finished airstrip under fire was still better than none at all. They laid the foundation with coral and rubble, crushed and compacted until it formed a base hard enough to support aircraft. Then came the miracle of Marston matting. Pierced steel planks, each one heavy and awkward, were laid out by hand and locked together like an endless puzzle. Line after line of them stretched forward, transforming rough coral into smooth, gleaming runway. Teams of men sweated under the blazing sun, their hands blistered from dragging the steel, but as each section locked in place the airfield took shape before their eyes. It was like watching a giant machine being assembled in fast motion. The Japanese could hardly believe what they were seeing. Scouts who managed to peek at the construction returned with reports that defied logic. Runways were already operational in less than 3 weeks. Bombers were taxiing on strips that, according to every calculation, should not have been finished for months. Intelligence officers argued over the reports, convinced that spies must be exaggerating. How could Americans build something so quickly on bare coral? Yet the reality was undeniable. Soon reconnaissance planes spotted squadrons of heavy bombers lined up where days earlier there had been nothing but jungle. For the men on the ground, the strain was immense. Sweat soaked their uniforms until they were stiff with salt. The noise was constant: engines, drills, explosions, shouted commands. Food was hurried, sleep snatched in brief stretches on cots or even on the ground beside the machines. But morale stayed surprisingly high. The Seabees took pride in every new section of runway, in every milestone reached. They joked that while the Marines took islands with bullets, they took them with bulldozers. Each man knew that the faster they built, the sooner American aircraft would be in the sky protecting them all. By the 20th day, a full 6,000-foot airstrip stretched across the once barren island. Dust still hung in the air, the finishing touches still rough, but the runway was ready. A B-24 bomber rolled forward, its engines thundering, and with a roar lifted into the sky. Cheers erupted from the Seabees and Marines alike. The impossible had been done. Where there had been jungle and coral, there was now a runway long enough for heavy bombers, capable of projecting power hundreds of miles farther into Japanese-held territory. The feat became a legend almost immediately. Reports circulated through American command about the speed of the construction, and even hardened generals marveled at the efficiency. The Japanese were left stunned, their defensive plans shattered by a pace of war they had not anticipated. The island, once considered safe for months, was now a forward base for American bombers in less than 3 weeks. For the Seabees, it was just another job done, another reminder of what could be achieved when determination, skill, and raw muscle were combined with the urgency of war. When the first bombers lifted off from those freshly carved runways, the sound carried farther than the roar of engines. It reverberated across the Pacific, echoing into Japanese command posts that had not expected American planes to be operating from such positions for months. Reconnaissance photos reached Tokyo showing unmistakable patterns, long, dark runways slicing through coral atolls that had only recently fallen into American hands. The disbelief was almost universal. Officers who had calculated the pace of war based on traditional construction methods suddenly realized their timetables were worthless. The Americans were moving at a speed that defied logic, and with each new strip the map of the Pacific tilted further against Japan. The shock was not just strategic but psychological. Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect ferocious infantry assaults, to endure naval bombardments, to fear carrier strikes. But no one had prepared them for the sight of airfields materializing out of nothing, as though conjured by some industrial sorcery. A captured Japanese diary spoke of the iron ants who arrived after the Marines, swarming with machines, tearing down forests, leveling earth, and building airfields where none should exist. The writer could not comprehend how these men worked day and night, seemingly without rest, until runways stretched across ground that had been jungle weeks earlier. For soldiers who believed the Pacific's vastness and isolation would shield them, it was a shattering revelation. The tactical consequences came swiftly. Where Japanese garrisons once felt secure, believing the nearest American bombers too distant to pose an immediate threat, they suddenly found themselves within range. Fuel depots that had been safe now erupted in firestorms. Supply convoys moving under cover of darkness were strafed and sunk by fighters flying from newly finished strips. Even the vaunted Japanese Navy began to feel the pressure, as carrier task forces lost their aura of invincibility when land-based bombers could now reach farther across the ocean. The tempo of war accelerated, and Japan was forced onto the defensive in ways its commanders had not anticipated. Each airfield represented not only a new launch point for attacks but also a protective umbrella for advancing forces. Fighters flying from the Seabees runways provided cover for convoys and supported ground operations inland. The speed at which these airstrips appeared meant that American forces could leapfrog across the Pacific much faster than predicted. This island-hopping strategy, already bold in concept, became almost unstoppable in execution because the Seabees erased the delays that enemy planners assumed would slow it down. What should have been months of logistical buildup became weeks, sometimes mere days, and Japanese strongholds that had expected reprieve instead faced immediate assault. For the men in the field, the transformation was visceral. Marines who had fought through beachheads one week were astonished to see bombers roaring overhead the next, supported by runways they had watched rise out of the dirt and coral. Soldiers wrote home about the spectacle of giant B-24s taxiing across airstrips that had not existed when they first landed. One Marine described it as watching the Earth itself being turned into a weapon. The Seabees had become legends among the fighting men, their work inspiring confidence that no matter how remote or hostile the island, it could be turned into a fortress overnight. On the Japanese side, the impact on morale was equally dramatic. Reports filtered back from frontline units of American construction under fire, of runways being used before defenders could mount counterattacks. Commanders grew frustrated as supply lines were cut and reinforcements harassed by bombers flying from bases that should not have been operational yet. Soldiers began referring to the Americans' machines with a mix of fear and awe, describing bulldozers that seemed impervious to gunfire and men who built as though they could not be stopped. In a war already defined by industrial might, this visible demonstration of American capacity struck deep. The shock spread beyond the battlefield. Intelligence officers in Tokyo struggled to explain the phenomenon to higher command. Their assessments had long assumed that building and supplying a 6,000-foot runway on a remote island would take months of preparation, shipping, and manpower. Yet photographs proved otherwise. The Americans were somehow moving machines across oceans, unloading them onto hostile beaches, and creating airbases in less time than it took Japan to reinforce or evacuate its garrisons. The traditional balance of offense and defense had been upended. Fortifications that had taken years to prepare could be neutralized in weeks simply by surrounding them with newly established air power. Allies, too, took note of the accomplishment. British and Australian officers marveled at the scale and speed of the Seabees' work, recognizing that this industrial approach to warfare was rewriting the rules of strategy. The Pacific campaign became less about slow attrition and more about momentum, about striking before the enemy could react. Each new airstrip marked a line drawn closer to Japan itself, a countdown accelerated by the roar of bulldozers and the clang of steel planking. What the Japanese never fully grasped was that these airfields were not just military assets, they were symbols of inevitability. Every completed runway told the defenders that resistance was buying less and less time. The Pacific, which once seemed too vast for any enemy to master, was being made smaller with each passing week. The war was being fought not just with bombs and bullets but with construction equipment, sweat, and relentless determination. The speed of it all left the Japanese command reeling, as though the Americans were waging a different kind of war entirely, one where the battlefield itself could be reshaped almost overnight. The story of the Seabees did not end when the dust settled on those coral airstrips. Long after the bombers thundered into the skies and the islands became stepping stones toward Japan, their work continued to ripple outward in ways that few could have predicted. For the men who wore the B emblem on their shoulders, construction under fire became a way of life, and each new project seemed to demand more speed, more daring, and more ingenuity. They had proven that it was possible to change the course of battle with bulldozers and steel, and in doing so they set a new standard for what military engineering could achieve. As the war pressed deeper into the Pacific, the Seabees were everywhere. They built roads that carved through jungles thick with humidity and disease, creating lifelines that allowed supplies and reinforcements to flow where they were needed most. They raised fuel depots from nothing but coconut logs and scrap, making sure the planes they had enabled to fly could keep flying. They constructed hospitals in the middle of swamps, docks that reached into treacherous lagoons, and warehouses that stored the endless flood of material needed to sustain a global war. Each project carried the same urgency as the airstrips, because every hour saved meant lives preserved and battles tilted in favor of the Allies. The men themselves grew into legends among the troops they supported. Marines spoke of them with admiration, describing how they would arrive on islands still echoing with gunfire and, within days, transform the landscape. Soldiers who once doubted that a jungle could ever yield to man's will found themselves marching along firm roads laid down by Seabee hands. Even sailors passing through the bases marveled at how quickly barren islands became bustling hubs of activity, complete with mess halls, machine shops, and even makeshift theaters for brief moments of respite. The Seabees were not simply building for survival, they were building entire communities that kept the war machine alive. What made their accomplishments so remarkable was not just their skill but their spirit. Many were older men with decades of experience behind them, fathers and grandfathers who might have been expected to stay home. Yet they carried themselves with the same toughness as the Marines they worked alongside. They joked about their age, calling themselves the grandfathers of the Navy, but when it came time to clear land under fire, they showed the energy and grit of men half their years. Their pride lay not in medals or ceremonies but in the roar of aircraft lifting from runways they had carved from the earth. The Japanese, for their part, never fully adapted to this phenomenon. They built carefully, deliberately, taking months to prepare strongholds that they believed impregnable. The idea that airfields could be conjured almost overnight was alien to their way of war. Each time the Seabees completed another runway or harbor, the shockwaves reverberated through Japanese defenses. Commanders were forced to abandon strategies that depended on long delays, because delay had become impossible. Even after the war, Japanese veterans would speak with awe and frustration about the speed with which Americans turned wilderness into fortresses. In the years that followed the war's end, the Seabees did not fade into obscurity. Their skills were too valuable, their reputation too strong. When conflict flared again in Korea, they were there, building airstrips and bases in conditions just as unforgiving as the Pacific. In Vietnam, they hacked through jungles once more, carving out installations that allowed helicopters and jets to dominate the skies. Beyond wars, they became ambassadors of American strength in peace, dispatched to disaster zones where their bulldozers cleared rubble and their expertise restored hope. Earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods found the Seabees arriving with the same determination they had once carried onto battlefields. Their legacy was also etched into the doctrine of modern militaries. Before the Seabees, the assumption was that construction followed combat, that bases were built slowly after the fighting had moved on. After the Seabees, the lesson was clear: construction could be simultaneous with combat, and speed could be just as decisive as firepower. Modern expeditionary forces continue to follow that principle, deploying engineers and heavy equipment as part of the initial assault rather than as an afterthought. The very concept of rapid forward base construction, now taken for granted, was born in the desperate days when Seabees built runways in less than 3 weeks. For the men who lived it, the memories never faded. They remembered the heat and the mud, the sting of sweat in their eyes, the endless clatter of steel planking under their hands. They remembered the nights when floodlights turned battlefields into glowing construction zones, when the hum of machinery never stopped even as shells landed nearby. They remembered the cheers when the first planes took off, proof that their labor had tipped the balance once more. Their stories became part of a shared identity, a bond between generations of Seabees who would continue to take pride in the motto handed down to them: "We build, we fight." And still, decades after the last battles of World War II, their work can be traced in unexpected places. Runways they carved remain in use, some expanded into modern airports, others lying hidden beneath layers of jungle regrowth but still recognizable from the air. Docks they built have become the foundations of thriving ports. The ghostly outlines of their roads can still be seen on remote islands, silent reminders of a time when victory depended on men who could swing hammers as well as rifles. For those who study history, the Seabees stand as proof that wars are not only won by those who fire the guns but also by those who make it possible for the guns to be there in the first place.